mosaic has only emerged under Israeli rule. The problem you see with the establishment of the State of Israel, it did not come in a way to live with, in a peaceful way to live and exist with the other. It came as a dominating power. And that's why Jewish power today is being rejected. Not because they are Jews. And I do not like the implication that, we are against it because it is somehow Jewish power. No. Thank God for Jewish presence. But when Jews want to dominate others, that is unacceptable in today's world. And I believe personally that the 21st century will not tolerate it. We're coming to the end of this century, and the paradigm that we have suffered under is a dominator paradigm. And that needs to shift. We are talking today, when we talk about the future of Jerusalem, we are talking about a paradigm shift from domination to partnership. And this is what needs to happen in Jerusalem. Partnership, equal partnership. And if we really love the Jewish people and are concerned about their future, as well as the future of the Muslims and as well as the future of the Christians, believe me, there is no other way but sharing Jerusalem in partnership with each other. Thank you.
I think there's some misunderstanding about the term exclusive and the implications of that. What I'm arguing for is Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, undivided capital of Israel. I'm not arguing for exclusive Jewish presence in Jerusalem or Jewish control of all holy sites. By no means. There's no exclusivity here. I think the point that must be made is that politically there can only be one sovereign power in Jerusalem. And you can take your choice. It can be a Palestinian sovereign power, it can be an Israeli one. I don't know of any other realistic alternatives, but that's it. And then the question is, within that regimen, what is it going to look like? And I think we all agree there has to be freedom of access and freedom of worship, and all that is implied in those freedoms. But no one is talking about, certainly I'm not talking about exclusive presence. And I think that's an important point to reiterate. Father Atik mentioned, brought up the analogy of going to Egypt and throwing the Muslims out in favor of some kind of pharaoh powers. No one's talking about throwing the Muslims out. That's not the issue. No one's here is arguing. I'd like to take up a number of points that were made in the initial presentation as well as in the second round. On Professor Khalidi's point that no one denies the Jewish attachment to Jerusalem, I beg to differ. There are substantial voices in the Muslim world that do precisely deny that. And perhaps one illustrative quote would be King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who some 20 years ago scorned Jewish attachment to the Western Wall and said the Wailing Wall is a structure they weep against and they have no historic right to it. Another wall can be built for them to weep against. Complete scorn and disdain for this Jewish attachment. Many school books reflect that. Many speeches and khutbahs and so forth have reflected that over the years. Father Atik seemed to imply that I was saying that Jews have formed a majority in Jerusalem. If that was the case, I did not mean to say such a thing. What I said is that it looks like, it appears, that Muslims never formed a majority. It is clear that Jews were excluded under the Romans and during the Crusading period. But I think the valid point is that Muslims never formed a majority. There may have been a point in the later Middle Ages when they did, but overall they did not. He also criticized me for not using the word justice. Well, that's not in my vocabulary. I am a historian, and I'm trying to understand, use the history I know to understand the circumstances of today. And in my analysis, terms like justice just are not what I find useful. As for his parishioners not being allowed in, there is a clear and obvious reason for this exception to the general rules that there is free access to places of worship. There is, as you know, for security reasons, there has been off and on, at many points, a lack of permission for West Bankers to go into Israel proper. Once you're in Jerusalem, you're as good as in Israel, because there are no checks between Jerusalem and the rest of Israel. So this was a requirement of the current security regime, which will lapse when the terrorism has finally lapsed. And finally, the notion that Jewish power is not a poem in itself, but that a dominating, an aspiring dominant power is the problem. Well, I come back to this point that somebody has to be judged, that you can't have a truly divided city with divided sovereignty and share sovereignty. It doesn't work. Somebody has to be in charge. And while perfectly willing to see a partnership on the level of running the holiest spots, the holy places, there is no reason to try and create something that has not existed in the past and surely will not work in Jerusalem in the future, namely a partnership of political power. Thank you.
I'm torn as to how to take up my 4.5 minutes. Between the desire to make a few historical corrections and the desire to make a few political points, I'll come to both. Just a few minor corrections. Muslims do not believe that Abraham was intending to sacrifice his son Isaac. Muslims believe that Abraham was intending to sacrifice his son Ismail. That's what the Quran says. And in fact, while it's true that most Islamic traditions do relate that sacrifice to Mecca, there are in fact others that relate it to Jerusalem. It's not arrived at the same place. The only difference is a different son. I think that much of what Dr. Pike said about his understanding of how Islam is related to Jerusalem begs the point. Without knowing what he was going to say, I think I answered some of that by saying what is important is, of course, what people believe, at least as much as what is true. It's not to say that what is true is not important. It's very, very important. But as a political fact in today's world, we have to take account of what people believe. And I think that to argue, for example, that there is no reference to Jerusalem in the Quran, where for the better part of 13th or 14th centuries, that is how Muslims have interpreted Surah 17 of the Quran, is disingenuous in the extreme. In fact, there are arguments that from the very beginning it was and could only have been interpreted as meaning the Masjid al-Aqsa, Jerusalem. There are other commentators and interpreters who believe differently. The point is, Muslims have believed, almost all of them, for almost the entire history of Islam, that that's what the Quran is talking about. To argue against it is, I think, taking a disputable fact and turning it into a rather nasty political weapon. The Abbasids shifted the political capital to Mesopotamia. We know they did. But they continued to repair the shrines in Jerusalem. Yes, there was an earthquake that brought part of the Dome of the Rock down. They rebuilt it. I think all of this is intended to show something which I believe is a misuse of history. Again, the Crusades. Yes, before the Crusades there was not a great deal of attention to Jerusalem. The point is not that Nuruddin Zengi built a pulpit for the Masjid al-Aqsa in Aleppo for the time it would be liberated as a political tool, or that Salah ad-Din, later on his successor in the different dynasty, used Jerusalem politically. The point is that this was important and successful political propaganda because people believed in the importance of Jerusalem to them. And I think that is the essential thing. We can talk about how illusory what it was that motivated the Crusaders to come all the way from northwestern Europe to Palestine was. The important thing is that as a political fact, you had states established, at least in part, on the basis of these beliefs. The idea that Jerusalem was never a cultural center under Islam boggles the mind. And I think you just have to walk around and look at the names of the buildings, the Mamluk and Ayyubid and Ottoman buildings, such and such madrasa, such and such madrasa, such and such madrasa in Jerusalem, to understand that there were many important schools. That teaching in Jerusalem was of great importance. That Jerusalem was one of the great judgeships under the Ottomans, under other Ottoman dynasties. It was a major center of learning, and to say otherwise is wrong, is false. Finally, to say that Jerusalem only became important to Muslims with the arrival of Zionism is to ignore a huge amount of historical evidence. In my book, which is about to come out, picks up a couple of 18th century documents in which Muslim clerics in Jerusalem are writing to the Ottoman Sultan and saying, this is Ula al-Qiblatain wa Thalith al-Haramain, the first direction of prayer, the third holy place. Jerusalem is important for these and these reasons. It is threatened, and the Sultan responds. So clearly, within that polity, this was something that was important and understood. This is nothing to do with it. And I think it's almost outrageous to suggest that it is. The point is, yes, there have been times when Jerusalem is more important, and there are times that are less important, when it has been less important. Yes, there are times when it is woven centrally into the most important narratives, and there are times when it is not. This is as true for Jewish history as it is true for Muslim history. It certainly is true for the history of modern nationalisms, which are all recent. And it is as true, I would argue, for Zionism as it is for any religions. The last historical point I would dispute is that the city never had a Muslim majority. The only period I'm competent to talk about is the modern period. And the only people who are competent to count population are the people who govern. The Ottomans didn't have very good statistics, but they did have statistics. And their statistics are better than the ignorant views of a bunch of visitors who would come in and say, Europeans would say, oh, the number of people in Jerusalem is X, and their proportions are Y and Z. The Ottomans, according to Ottoman statistics, or whatever they're worth, there was a Muslim and an Arab majority in Jerusalem for most of the 19th century. Let me conclude by saying that I think that the people who argue for Israeli control over Jerusalem, exclusive Israeli control over Jerusalem, which is what I was talking about, political exclusive Israeli control over Jerusalem, have to be confronted with a couple of ugly facts. The first is that in international law, this cannot be. This is occupation. It is illegal. Whatever the Congress says, whatever we may say or not say here, this is a hard and nasty and ugly fact. In international law, East Jerusalem is occupied territory. That has to be dealt with. That has to be resolved. And it can't just be resolved by saying, in effect, you might do this, right? Secondly, saying that Israel, there has to only be one government, one rule, one sovereignty, one law. And that law has to be Israeli. It could be something else, but it should be Israeli. Means, and we have to say it, this means subjugation of 165,000 people and treating the national aspirations of the rest of that people, that's to say the other Palestinians who don't live in Jerusalem, with contempt. Now, I don't think this is doable if we're interested in settlement. I would argue that figuring out how you can have some form of shared or dual or divided sovereignty in a single city is easy. I don't think it's easy. But I don't think it's easy to force, I don't think it's easy, I don't think it's possible to force the status quo indefinitely into the future down the throats of Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. You cannot have final peace between the Arab states and Israel. In my view, if you don't resolve the Jerusalem issue, you can't resolve the Jerusalem issue on the basis of Israel, undivided, sole, exclusive Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem. It may be that I'm a foolish, naive optimist. It may be that we won't have a settlement. Well, it may be. But I would argue if we do want a settlement, if that is a value, then we should be able to devise some means whereby this joint, shared, divided, whatever may be worked out by the geniuses who do the drafting, sovereignty and control can be brought about. I would argue that just because something like this never existed in the past is no argument for not trying to do it in the future. And I would suggest to you that if we want this city and its people to have a bright future, we better be creative and inventive, and we better change our vocabularies. I mean, some of us are historians, and some of us maybe don't have some words in our vocabulary. But if we want to be useful to the people who are going to devise a future for the people who have to live there, I would argue that the term justice has to be somewhere in our vocabulary. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Now, I'd like to turn to questions. Let me start with a calm one. The gentleman out of Pittsburgh has touched on, but I'd like to hear, or at least see a show of hands if everyone else is inarticulate. What do you think of the post-World War II idea of internationalizing Jerusalem? Al-Rafi?
I think many people still see it as the best idea out of the impasse that we find ourselves in. My own option is that it is much better if we arrive at a different solution. And that's why I insist on the sharing. I think it is. I think there probably has to be some form of international presence when it comes to the whole city of Jerusalem. I mean, this is a long topic to be dealt with, just a simple reply. But I believe, for the sake of a just peace, I would love to see the Israelis and the Palestinians sharing the city rather than separating it as a corpus apart, as it was suggested. So that would be my own idea.
I don't think it's realistic. There are no parts of the world that don't have sovereignty. And so I believe this terribly disputed area is not likely to work out as the first one. But as an aside, I might say that it's acceptable to me once Rome and Mecca are also international.
I don't think it's a practical. I don't think that internationalization of Jerusalem is a practical alternative. Simply because I think that instead of bringing the two sides which dispute the city to somehow compromise with one another, you will in effect be alienating both of them. I don't think it's practical.
I really, a shared Jerusalem, you're almost like Pavlov's dog. The moment somebody says shared Jerusalem, bingo. What Jerusalem are we going to share? Are we going to share West Jerusalem with all of Israel's capital institutions? Is West Jerusalem going to be controlled together with East Jerusalem by some kind of shared sovereignty? I don't think it will fly. Think about it a little bit. You know it won't fly. What I said at the beginning, I repeat again. I said it in my earlier remarks, the opening remarks. Jerusalem must be divided. Remember, I said, you'll find it on tape if it passed by you, I said that the annexation of East Jerusalem by Israel was nonsense. They were dealing with a Palestinian people which did not want to be ruled by another people. And if the line between Jordan and Israel once ran through Jerusalem, it can certainly run through Jerusalem again. Which should then be an open city, there should then be easy access, easy passage, and so on and so forth. The real problem, that several people have alluded, is what are you going to do with the walled city? And on that particular matter, on that particular complication, certainly there should be international interest, but I continue to believe that somebody that's one of the very few times in public or in private in recent years that Danny Pipes and I agree, that somebody has to take the lead. And I think, and I say again, that which you didn't want to do. The sight of Jewish uniforms is not something that needs to be regarded as offensive. Therefore, I believe in division, hoping that eventually there will be unity.
Thank you. Looking ahead, briefly looking back, East Jerusalem's present size was the result of a 12-fold expansion beyond the municipal lines under Jordanian Hashemite rule. What was the basis for that division in June of 1967? And what is the prospects once again for redrawing those municipal boundaries? Volunteers this time. Alberti.
I really did not understand the question. I don't think maybe somebody else answer.
Danny, start.
Clearly, the Israeli government has much expanded the boundaries of municipal Jerusalem to areas which are of little interest to the world at large. And clearly, those areas which it has been expanded to could, in the context of this discussion, be retraced. None of the boundaries in this area are final. And I would certainly have no problem with a smaller group, like what it was in years past. The issue is the sacred, the holy parts, not the extended municipal boundaries.
Please.
I find myself in rare agreement with that point. But let me hasten to add that there is a further problem, which is that the Israeli population, the Israeli Jewish population in occupied Arab East Jerusalem is now larger than the Arab population as a result of the establishment of neighborhoods. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to call them settlements anymore. You go and visit them. They're huge, old, in some cases, almost 30-year-old neighborhoods, which envelop the city from the northwest, north, and increasingly along to the east as well as the south. And in fact, I agree. Whatever happens, these frontiers will have to, the municipal boundaries will have to be retraced. I would note, incidentally, that this is not the first time that the municipal boundaries have been retraced. The British, when they instituted the municipality of Jerusalem under the beginning of the mandate, took the old Ottoman municipal boundaries and changed them markedly, including every area of Jewish population and excluding areas like Siloam, which were within spitting distance of the walls of the old city. The idea was to gerrymander, a very good American word, gerrymander a city in which there was a large Jewish majority, which included the entire Jewish population of the environs of Jerusalem. So it's not the first time it's happened. It can be redone. And in fact, I would argue that that may be an avenue to solving some of these problems, but it leaves the old city. And I have to say, the core of everything for everybody, since a lot of it has religion as its touchstone, is the old city. The sacred and the important connections, as well as the important historical connections for all sides, are not, unfortunately, in Isaiah or Abu Dis or Hashemon or wherever it may be, or Givat Zev or Piskat Zev or whatever. They are in that same square of the old city. And that would be much harder to resolve.
May I have a comment? I think we're now really getting to pay dirt. And of course we will. Nationalism is something which grew up lately. And may I add to your arsenal that Jerusalem was excluded by the early Zionists 100 years ago. They regarded it as a city of old fuddy-duddies, very much right-wing. They weren't going to create any agricultural colonies. And in the first draft of the suggestion for the creation of a Hebrew university, which is the crown jewel of Jerusalem, the first draft was, let's put it anywhere in the land but not in Jerusalem, because we represent the creation of a new Jewish spirit. Jerusalem becomes very central, increasingly central, even to Zionism, modern Zionism in the 20th century. But these are facts. Well, there's another fact. Very deep in Jewish consciousness, and I'm trying to get it across to you because I'm sitting here because I've spent my life being supposedly sometimes even the liberal within the Jewish community on most of these issues. I'm the guy who started to scream back in '69 when I had just joined the Zionist executive that there had to be a two-state solution, and Golda Meir sent a letter, where did this traitor get into the Zionist executive? I have the credentials and the career to say to you that deep in the consciousness of Jews is that every time someone else throughout history has controlled the walled city, Jews have gotten an unfair shake. deep in our craw. It's deep in my craw. There were arrangements made in the ark.